Hey, pilot, welcome back to Ready for Pushback. I'm Nick Fialka. I'm your host today, and my guest is a guy named Harry Yee. And today's conversation is totally different and very interesting. It's all about being an aircraft dispatcher. Harry is on his path to becoming a professional dispatcher. He's also a guard helicopter pilot. And so this is a long one, folks. We talk in depth about what dispatch is, how to get involved with dispatch, all the resources that are out there. And then we pivot and we talk about being in the reserves in the military and how good it is and how it can be a struggle sometime. And that is something I haven't talked about very much. And it was Harry's idea to jump into it. And I love that because the things that we do in aviation are varied. And the things that we do in aviation can take a lot of different directions. And as they do, it's better to know what you're getting into before you make a big time decision. And so I hope this is really fruitful for you. I thought it was fantastic. It was so much fun. If you guys haven't given a review yet to the show, I'd love it if you could like and subscribe on the old YouTube thing. On the Apple Podcasts, you can write a review. You know, my goal before the end of 2024 is to hit 800 reviews, and that I'm well on my way, and I'm thankful for each and every person that has done so. So thank you. So this is a great show, great episode. It's a long one, so sit back, relax. Let's get ready for Pushback.
Most pilots don't understand what career opportunities are available in the world of aviation. They're making career decisions based on advice from friends or posts on internet forums, meaning they are taking huge risks with their livelihood without having all the details. This podcast was created to help you understand the aviation industry so you can find your dream job. Let's get ready for Pushback. Here's your host and my dad, Nick Fialka.
All right, my man, Harry. What's up, man? How are you?
Good, Nick. I'm doing great this morning. How are you?
Man, it's a good day. I'm doing a show with you, and this is going to be really fun. I'm not going to even spoil it. Talk to me. Tell me about who you are, what your background is, and how we met.
Yeah, so I'll start with how we met. I volunteered at RTAG this last year. Came up to you in the Spitfire team. I was actually running the breakout sessions. So I was in the room that you guys did your presentation at. So I was helping run a lot of the AV, kind of funneling people in and out of the room.
How was the presentation?
The presentation was great. It was between me kind of trying to like pull people in the room. So I was literally outside the room, kind of like in and out, kind of getting little tidbits of what you were saying. But it was... I was generally focused on trying to get people in there because they're like, are you looking for Go Jets? Are you looking for Spitfire? And everyone's kind of like, what's Spitfire? I'm like, come on in.
Come on in. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, no, so we met at RTAG. I just kind of shook your hand because I listened to the podcast essentially since episode 1, which can kind of lead me into a little bit of my background. So I live in the Chicagoland area and grew up in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And for me, when I was growing up, my path to success was generally you go to school, you go to college, and then you get a job working in the city, somewhere in finance, somewhere in the legal field, something like that. That's kind of the cookie cutter path to success, which, depending on your definition, could be what you need. You need stability, you need a solid paycheck, all those things, right? So I'm literally standing there at the metro station, and I'm in the RTAG Facebook group, and your post pops up for episode 1. This is going to be the greatest podcast on planet Earth. And I go, well, sure, I guess I'll listen, right? So I tuned in on Spotify, just have my earbuds in and on the train to and from work, half an hour each day. And whenever your episodes drop, I'm listening. I'm standing on the platform listening, and I'm watching all the departures from O'Hare fly overhead. And I'm like, man, maybe I should try to change things up. Maybe I don't need to work in the city and be successful that way.
No kidding. That's wild, dude. So were you already in the military a couple years back?
Yeah. So I joined RTAG because I've been in the National Guard, both the Minnesota National Guard and the Wisconsin National Guard for the past 10 and a half years or so. So I joined in 2014 originally to pay for school, and I joined as a 12 Bravo combat engineer. So kind of the more combat arms side. and switched over to the aviation side of the house in about 2018 and went to flight school for the Army in 2020, which was kind of during COVID. It was kind of a weird time, but 2020 to 2022. And came back here to Illinois after I was done and still drill and do my thing up in the Wisconsin Guard. So it's kind of a good
Are you
mix.
flying 60s up there?
Yep, we got 60. So I am in the Medivac units. So Sean Cyril, he's the one who pulled me into doing the volunteer stuff. So he's a pilot out of Madison, so they fly the Mike models, MFD, kind of more 21st century edition.
Yeah.
But we're in Medivac, so we got the Lima edition, anything from early 80s to kind of mid 90s on the serial numbers.
Listen, man, those Limas, they remind me of like Mater from Cars. They always just look tired and they're all beat up. I know, I flew Foxtrots for God's sake.
Man.
Like those things. Listen, don't get me started. That's awesome, dude. Listen, I love you're saying names of, like Sean is such a great human, and like the guard community is so cool. And I want to come back to that. I want to put a pin on that, but you've got a regular job too, right? But you're not an aviator at an airline or something. Talk to me about your job.
Sure. Yeah, so right now I'm actually in a career transition. So right now I am known as a guard bum, where I collect a check by doing my guard duty. So I left the accounting world, I would say 2023, and got a job in the right seat as a co-pilot for a company called PJ Helicopters, and they do construction, utility, and firefighting work. And they have a fleet of a bunch of surplus Alpha Plus model Blackhawks that they use. And you come out of flight school with an S70 type rating. So they put you in the right seat because you're familiar, as long as you meet their insurance minimums for their time requirement. And they pair you up with a PIC who has thousands and thousands of hours of 133 HEC time. So they're familiar with the job work, but not as familiar with the airframe. And so that's how we kind of get paired up that way. So,
that's so interesting.
Kind of ran that job for about a season and a half, because there's a rotational seasonal basis for their co-pilot employees, which essentially are all guard pilots.
Okay. Did you like it? Was it fun?
I loved it. It was like some good cowboy flying, like especially for the Forest Service fire contracts. I was kind of all over the place, kind of around Fort Polk, Louisiana. So last season actually was really dry later in the season, kind of in the south and out east. So there's stuff popping up. Actually, you hear about it a lot on the West Coast, but kind of down south and out east last season, particularly the water tables were super low. So they were having problems in areas they don't usually. So I was in Louisiana, Kentucky, Virginia, kind of all over the place doing that. And it's you and your crew. You got yourself, your PIC. You got your mechanic who has like a dually with a trailer that has all the tools in it. And then you have another guy who is a truck driver, and he drives the 18-wheeler full of Jet A. So those two will drive kind of in tandem, and they'll meet you at wherever you're going, some tiny podunk airport in the middle of nowhere, and they'll just coordinate. PIC will coordinate with the whoever manages the airport. We'll go set up our trucks on one side of it, and we'll have the helicopter there with the bucket sitting out, and we have our Forest Service employee with us, and then they'll give us the call. They're like, "Hey, we got to go somewhere." We go, "All right, sounds good. Put on our flight suits. Let's go." So
it's like a tent revival for helicopters.
Kind of, but we get to stay in hotels. They do put us up. We don't have to stay at the airfield because it's a VFR day program.
Well, I figure they're grabbing all the guard guys who are used to camping anyway. So you guys just they probably throw you on a cot and give you $20 a day in per diem and call it good.
I know, right? So I'm super shocked. I'm like, wow, we got our own hotel rooms. We get a good per diem. I'm like, what are we talking about? This is great. This sure beats DTS.
Every Air Force person that's listening to this right now is thinking to themselves, what in the hell is this guy talking about? How could he even imagine not staying at the Ritz? So hats off to my Air Force brothers and sisters.
Yeah, so that was a really good gig. Got a lot of experience. It's been helping me on the guard side too, because it's in the same airframe. But for me, it was not necessarily the lifestyle I was looking for, because to make a decent amount of money, you have to make the trips longer. So you have to be gone for 3 or 4 weeks at a time to really make some decent cash, right? and that's just not the lifestyle that I wanted moving forward. Recently married a couple years ago, and we want kids. That's kind of on the horizon, and I would like to be a little more present. So that kind of kept me searching for what other career fields I could look into that is tied with aviation, but also allows me and affords me to be home more often. So that kind of leads us into our discussion, I think, about dispatch, which is something I kind of discovered more recently and I'm pursuing right now.
Dispatch. Will you please explain to the kids at home, anybody that is not in an airline may not know what a dispatcher is or does. So walk me through it.
Sure, I guess the way I can explain it is, especially someone who has maybe some flight training under their belt. So usually you have a whole bunch of different tasks you have to do as the PIC, right? You have to do your flight planning, where you're going to go, how you're going to get there. You have to consider the airspace. You have to do your weight and balance, load calculation. You have to do all those tasks on top of being at the controls and flying the aircraft. And that's generally for Part 91, Part 135 flying is generally on the onus of the crew to fulfill all those things. But from my understanding and from what I've been told is that in the 121 world, the airline world, because of the volume of travel and the volume of flights that are occurring, you can't put that all in one person. So the way I understand it is that that has been split into a separate job entirely. So when you show up, and the guys in the guard unit who fly for airlines, they show up, they go, yeah, I show up to the gate, I get my packet of information, where I'm going, the routes I'm taking, the amount of people I'm taking with me, all in this packet that shows up on the iPad, 45 minutes before the departure. Well, that packet has to come from somewhere. So there's a whole team of people at these major airlines that just does that. They do all the pre-flight planning, all the calculations, they coordinate with maintenance. They also will end up doing, beyond the pre-flight stuff, they'll do a lot of in-flight monitoring as well. So if a SIGBIT comes out, something that was not forecast, they'll relay all that information to the PIC so the PIC can make an informed decision.
And from my perspective as the airline pilot, that the dispatcher, when you sit down in the jet and you open up your iPad and you figure out where you're going, what the weather is, how much gas you've got, how many people you've got, what the NOTAMs are, all the different things are accounted for on this release, which is built by the dispatcher. And that dispatcher, right at the very top, is the name of the dispatcher who planned it and their phone number. And I probably 80% of the time will pick up the phone on grab my cell phone and call that dispatcher to talk about whether maybe the route, maybe the weather, maybe, I fly a lot of Florida stuff. So lots of just train wrecks at Jacksonville Center. And we talk about that. A lot of things we talk about. If there's a maintenance issue with the aircraft, I look at the dispatcher as the other team, the third teammate, right? The third leg of the stool, because I've got my first officer. Clearly I got my flight attendants, don't want to discount them, but that dispatcher, as far as planning and operating that thing, so crucial. And I can call them while I'm flying. I can text them on our little ACARS system, which is like old school text messaging, like pager style. And man, they have the ability. The best part is you're in the office, they're in the operations center. So it's, I'm making like hand movements, like the people watching me on YouTube are like, what the hell? But they have the access, right? If there's a security problem, they've got access to security people. You need like something maintenance, you lose a generator, you lose a hydraulic, whatever it is, or you need to divert, they are on top of it. And you communicate with them, and a seriously good dispatcher. A lot of times they're aviators themselves, but by God, dispatchers can be the best part of your day. If you have a solid, good dispatcher that's thinking ahead, that's like, hey, I gave you some extra fuel for this. I hate getting shorted in fuel. I will call, I'll be like, I need 2,000 more pounds of gas all day long. But anyway, I'm going on a rant. I think a dispatcher is such an important thing. How did you figure out that you don't have dispatchers in the Guard? So how the hell do you figure this out?
So correct. We don't have dispatchers in the Guard. There's a couple of different jobs in the military that kind of are equivalent in certain ways. Like we do have 15 Papas in the Army that are flight operations that end up doing a lot of flight following functions, but they don't get trained in the same manner as pilots where they have all the pre-flight experience where they don't really know what different types of airspace are. A lot of the times they don't do the weight and balance. But we also have the Air Force gives us our weather briefings. So that's kind of more akin a little bit to the dispatch, where you have weather specialists that'll give you the weather briefing, but that's really specific to the weather. Like you're saying, dispatch is kind of a one-stop shop, your point of contact. Like you're saying, the person you're talking to outside the cockpit that can help coordinate a whole bunch of different things.
And you know the rules too, right?
Right.
You know the rules about the weather. You know the rules about the alternates. You know the rules about the fuel. You know the rules about the weight and balance. Like you know all those rules more than probably the pilot does.
Correct. That's a huge part. I think we probably get into it as far as the course curriculum, but a huge part of it is just FARs and digging into Part 121 and going, okay, one is a departure alternate required. Okay, and then you have to think about everything, and you have to, okay, well, what's the rule with that? It has to be within an hour of cruise. You have to know all that stuff, right? So you can make sure the airline and the crew is in compliance, so they're not going to get violated by the FAA, which is a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I get violated by the also if it's been well thought out, that oh shit moment when you're like a couple weeks ago when I was going into Norfolk and I had to divert. I had an alternate of Charlotte, I think, and then as I'm texting like diverting to CLT, and the dude's like, "Hey, there's 3 more other airports closer. You can go here, here, here. Here's your fuel numbers. Here's this and that." And I was like, psh, busted, like crushing it. It was awesome.
Yeah. Man, there's so many tangents I want to go on right now. Where
I
I'm like,
know.
okay, hold on. Like, I was like, well, okay. I even forgot the original question that you had asked.
I don't know, but let's talk dispatch.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to tie it a little bit to the guard because that just seems really relevant right now. What you're saying, like the dispatcher, they don't tell you have to do something. They give you options, right? Here are 3 possible solutions to the problem you're faced with. And that's really similar to what warrant officers do in the Army, which is kind of a unique thing to Army aviation. Most other branches don't have a lot of warrants, but what's taught to us immediately when you start becoming a warrant and you go to candidate school is that you're supposed to advise and provide the commander or whoever your customer is with solutions, right? Again, it's not like you have to go do this course of action, but here are 3 options. I think this is the best option. Here's option number 2. Here's option number 3. I'm not going to choose because that's your job. You're the commander. You're the PIC. But here are 3 potential solutions to your problem. If you need something else, I can look into that as well.
A little more than that, though, because sometimes I'll lean on a dispatcher for a recommendation. Like, hey, there's 3 options. And I'm like, all right, maybe one of those options is, think about ceilings. Yeah, this one has the highest ceiling. This one has the lowest ceiling. This one has, so we went to Charlotte on this thing. I may have done a show on it or not. So this one we went to Charlotte, and my aircraft 757 doesn't usually go to Charlotte. It hasn't been to Charlotte in I want to say 7 or 8 years. And so we got there, and there were all sorts of complications. Taxiing was a complication. And then the biggest complication was getting fuel because nobody on the airport was certified to fuel a 757. And so they had to go get some cat from the FBO. I think it's like Signature or something. And it took forever to get the person there. God bless that human for coming and filling up our gas tank. But, that was not a deliberate thing, but I think that neither the dispatcher or I would have thought about that. But then when I brought it over to the dispatcher, I called him back up. I'm like, hey, this is what's going on. He's like, oh, well, that would have been really nice to know, wouldn't it? I'm like, yeah, no kidding, man. But it gives everybody more tools for the toolbox. It is literally this great close teamwork part of what we do. I love it. And so talk to me about the school. It's not easy. How long is it? Where is it? How do you does the VA pay you for it? What do you use in your GI Bill?
Sure. Okay. We can talk about that. So I didn't know that this job set existed. I didn't know that this was a thing, right? Because you hear a lot about the pilot path and the pilot career path and what it takes and the skills and the training requirements to become an ATP. So that's kind of what I knew. There's some buddies in the Guard that work for Sun and Country, United, Allegiant, kind of the spectrum, right? So that's kind of the stories that I was hearing and understanding and hearing during the pilot boom that was happening in 2022, 2023 for hiring. All these guys were kind of talking about that process. So I started on that process. So I ended up going after my they call it the add-on rating. So in the back of the ACS, if you already have a commercial license, so if you already have a commercial rotorcraft license, you only have to do certain tasks. And oftentimes they cut out like navigation. They're like, you know how to navigate, so we don't have to test that again in theory. So I ended up getting the commercial airplane ratings through multi-engine and the airplane instrument rating. And at the same time, for that long cross country for commercial, I went and actually rented the plane for my flying club and went and visited some friends we had that we met down at Fort Rucker during flight school, and they're all part of the Nebraska National Guard. So I took my Cessna and I picked up a couple of my friends in Madison, and then we flew out to Lincoln, Nebraska area, and had a good little trip with them, some bonding, so a little bit of reminiscing, and come to find out that let's think about two of them actually got jobs working for Union Pacific, the railroad, as railroad dispatchers. And they were kind of explaining that, yeah, we come back from flight school and it's kind of hard trying to find a full-time job because you kind of have done the training for a full-time job, but that you end up with a part-time job in the Guard. So they're like, well, then you're kind of on your own to figure it out, whether you're going to, get into law enforcement and be a cop, or try to get a full-time job with the Guard, or whatever else you end up doing. So they ended up pursuing this Union Pacific dispatch position, and they said, yeah, they love us. They, as military aviators, they love the training that we have, um, the fact that we do crew resource management, as well as a lot of the other military uh, values of discipline and order, things like that. They love it. So they got hired pretty much as is as dispatchers for the railroad. So that kind of got my gears turning a little bit. I think we discussed earlier, I was kind of searching for something where, I could be home a little bit more versus being on the road a lot, which, again, being an airline pilot probably wasn't the best choice if that was my goal and priority. um, so I got my gears turning. I went back to Chicagoland area and kind of looked into a couple of things like, well, maybe, could I get a job in the railroad or something like that around here? There's the commuter line that's owned by UP, but there's not a lot of information out about that. And so I actually looked into Part 65, which is the certification process for aircraft dispatchers in the airline world. And there's a couple of different schools that are run in the Chicagoland area, because it's another certification. So you'll get your card for your pilot certification, has all your stuff on it. But then you'll get another card as a different kind of crew member, as an aircraft dispatcher. And so I looked into that process a little bit, and I kind of shelved it for a while because I didn't know if it would turn into a job, right? I was, well, if you can get the certification, but what does that really qualify you for? I don't know anyone, in those positions. So I kind of shelved that for a little bit. And then fast forward probably a month or two after that trip I had taken to go see my friends in the Guard. You talk about volunteerism a lot on your show, and I actually had started volunteering with the Civil Air Patrol at my local wing. And at Chicago Executive, they do annually a 5K. So they'll close down the airport, and it's called Run the Runway. So I volunteered with the Civil Air Patrol. I was handing out waters and oranges and electrolyte powder and all that good stuff, right? And across the taxiway, there was this booth, and this one of the schools I had seen online that offers the dispatch course. It's Flight Innovation Incorporated. They're based in Mount Prospect, Illinois. And so they had a booth at this Run the Runway event. So I just, I walked over there. I was like, hey, can you cover the booth for a second? And, the guy I was working with said, yeah, sure, no problem. Kind of went over and just kind of chatted him up a little bit. I was like, introduced myself, and he kind of explained the process a little bit. And something that really got my attention was that the guy that actually runs kind of the business side of the school, is currently for like the last 12 years as a United aircraft dispatcher. So he's currently working that job as well as running a certification course that's certified by the FAA to give you your license. So he was talking to me a little bit about that. And what really pulled me in is that he offered to give me a tour of the NOC for United. And I was like, well, sure, I guess I can go in and take a look at that's awesome opportunity. So he said, yeah, come in on some weekend morning where it's not busy. And I think a couple weeks later, he went down, sit down at his desk, and he was doing like the Atlantic desk or something. And he was answering my questions, and he was planning flights and briefing captains and doing it all. And so I was super impressed. And he talked a lot about just kind of that career field. And so that was my in. That was my exposure to what that career path could turn into, because I wanted to have a goal in mind. I wanted to have, hey, I'm going to work towards that as far as employment opportunity, because I'm kind of at the point right now where I don't really want to be wasting my time. I want to be very meaningful and deliberate with what I decide to spend my money on and the time I decide to spend on it. So with that goal in mind, the next day I signed up for the course.
So you sign up for the course. How long is the course?
Sure. So to preface it, each course is separately certified by the FAA. So kind of think of like 141 programs, where each program they have to meet the criteria that's set out by the FAA, but they all accomplish that criteria perhaps in a slightly different manner as far as the curriculum goes and the order in which they do it. So if I can't speak to the other schools that exist out there, but for ours, it's an 8-week program, and they run class on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday on an AM and a PM. So it's 5-hour blocks. So it's either 8 a.m. through 1 p.m. or 3 p.m. through 8 p.m. And you can flip flop back and forth. They have the capacity to flip if you're like, hey, I got work, and I need to pop into the evening session instead of the morning session for Thursday or something. They can do that. But 8 weeks, 5 hours a day for 5 days a week.
At the end, there's a big test where you get certified?
There sure is. So it's kind of like a check ride. There's a PTS out there. So there's not an ACS, but there's a PTS out there from the FAA about how they're supposed to run the exams. And it is kind of like that where, from what I understand, so I'm supposed to be doing this here in the next couple of weeks, and they're kind of spooling us up for what this is going to look like. But to me, it sounds a lot like a check ride. So you're going to come in, and they're going to make sure you have all your documentation, that you're eligible to take the test. You have your application in IACRA and everything. So they'll come in and they'll do that kind of like normal, like a check ride. And then what they'll do is they'll have you plan a flight. And everything's manual. So you have like a basic calculator, and you have your chart, like paper charts, right? So you're going to manually plan a flight from wherever they say hey, we're going to go from San Francisco to Denver or wherever else you decide to go, right? So you plan your flight. Usually, they say it takes about a couple hours to do that. Apparently, the examiner will either just hang out in the room with you, or they'll go grab lunch or something and then come back when you're done. So then you'll plan your flight, and then when they return, they'll take a look at your paperwork. You have like 7 different forms that you have, a couple worksheets. You have, like you mentioned, you have your dispatch release, you have your load calculation sheet, you have a couple of different things that you'll have prepared for them. And from there, that's when they launch into the oral, right? So I think what they'll end up doing is they'll look at your flight plan, and by reviewing your flight plan, they are going to ask you a lot of questions, and they're going to hit on all the topics that are required by the PTS in order to certify you for your dispatch license. So I think a similar format to a check ride, but obviously there's no flight maneuvers. You're not in an aircraft, you're at a desk. So similar format, but no aircraft maneuvers.
Do you feel like there's a ton of information to learn, or do you feel like you've got a pretty decent handle on it even before you started?
So a lot of the knowledge overlaps heavily with the pilot training and pilot knowledge that you're required to know for a check ride. So a lot of that's the same. So for me, I started my aviation journey kind of in 2020. So I've had, I would say, like 4 years and military instruction to guide me, because weather is weather, right? That doesn't really change, right? FARs change, right? So we're not talking about military regulation. We're not talking about Part 91. We're talking about Part 121. So there's a different rule book to learn there. But definitely having pilot experience was a huge, huge advantage that I had coming into it. And as it stands right now, we have a class of, I want to say about 16 people, and there's one person who has a little bit of Part 141 experience. He was in a program and then decided not to follow through with it, so he has some experience. But I'm the only person in class right now that has any flying or FAA ratings.
I have met, I don't know if you hang out in like the dispatcher forums on Reddit or not. I don't even know if there are dispatcher forums, but the people I know that are dispatchers, more than a few are former 121 pilots who have lost their medical and have decided that that's the way to go. And it's because they love the aviation aspect. Do you feel like, hey, this is going to be a great job for my life? Or do you have any kind of internal desire to go to the, like, as an airline pilot? Or what is your mental state on where you want to be?
Yeah, I think that's kind of been a process that I've been working through and kind of thinking about a lot this last year. And I've pretty much decided that dispatch is where I would like to be because I still get to fly with the Guard. So don't get me wrong, I love flying and I like what I do in the Guard. I like flying the helicopter. I like the medevac mission set. So I can kind of get that fix of flying. I'm also part of a flying club, so I can kind of get the fix of flying. Obviously, it's not a jet. It's completely different from that aspect of it. But for myself, when you look at your career path and what you want to do, you have to consider all those factors, right? You have to consider the compensation that you're going to get from whatever you choose. And then you have to consider the lifestyle. How much are you on the road? Am I pulling, midnight shift? What am I doing as far as my scheduling goes? And then you have to think about what you get out of the fulfillment from a job, right? So when considering all those factors for myself, that's what works for me. That's kind of the makeup that I've concluded, at least right now in my life and my goals moving forward of starting a family. That's where I would like to be for the long term.
All right, so you just opened up a whole new can of worms. So we got to go to each can.
Oh boy!
Now I got to know, how much money does a dispatcher make?
Yeah, so I guess I could talk about United because that's kind of my target, and then the network that I have here in Chicagoland are people who work for United. So their scheduling, as it stands right now with their current contract, so they're also a union job. But they're not part of the pilot union. They are a dispatch union. So they have a different union, but they are represented by a different group. So the current contract they have is 5 days on, 2 days off, 5 days on, 5 days off for 8-hour shifts. They say starting pay, according to the sheet here, is they tally it out per month. So it says $78.50 a month for first year pay, and then close to $14,300 a month topped out, which I think is the top of the 10-year scale. Which, if I do my calculator math here, starting pay is about like $94 a year without overtime, and then topped out at the end of the scale is $171 a year without overtime. And that's at a major. So you do have to consider the same thing where all the regional companies are also 121 operators, so they also need dispatchers. And for them, you can expect, you're making $25 an hour maybe doing a dispatch job for a regional. So it's kind of what you would expect to gain experience moving along.
Do you have to play that game? So when you finish here and you take your test and you crush it, can you get hired on at United, or are you going to have to go to a regional first, kind of like I had to do?
Right. So there's a few different paths, and it's maybe akin to the pilot hiring where that is a path you can go, but there are multiple paths, right? So a path you can go if you don't have any experience in the aviation world, you don't have any experience as a pilot or as a dispatcher, you might be able to get a job at a regional. So the class prior to mine, she came in and she talked to us a little bit, and she got hired at SkyWest as a dispatcher. And that is a route you can go, is you can get a job as a dispatcher for a regional and then build your experience there, right? You have 3-4 years relevant experience. And then when an opportunity opens up at one of the majors, you can send your application into a major and go through their interview process and hopefully get picked up by them. Other route you can go, and from what other people have said, is that you can try to get a job at the company of that you desire. So for me, United again, you can get another job within the National Operations Center. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit. So the NOC, think of it as like this big old, like one gigantic room, right? And you have all these desks and computers and stations, and you have like your maintenance reps over here, and you have crew scheduling over here, and so all these different functions are in the same room in the same building together. So the other way you can go is to try to get a job in the NOC in a different position, whether that's crew scheduling or dispatch support or load planning. That's another job that's available to you. So you can try to get one of those jobs at the company of your choosing and then work into the dispatch position from there. So that's a couple of different routes you can go.
Does it take a long time, you think? Are there opportunities? Because there's no mandatory retirement. So how long are you going to have to sit on the bench before you can jump into that realm?
That's a good question. And of course, I'm asking myself that every day. And like, we're all speculating in class. We're like, oh man, like who's most qualified for the job? Because I'm in class right now. We have some crew schedulers. That's actually I think we have like 4 United crew schedulers in class, like 4 out of the 16. So like a quarter of our class is like crew scheduling, and it's like their method for moving up.
I would hate to be on the answering the phone and crew scheduling when some of these pilots call.
Yeah, they're a little every time we're sitting in class, they're talking about the previous day and the whatever it would be, the weather that blew through somewhere, and they're like, man, I had a long day yesterday because they got to play this weird game and try to make sure people are timing out, and they don't have someone they can fill in the spot, and they have to call. So yeah, they have a little bit of a stressful job from what I understand.
Yeah, both sides, like the business side of like, oh, we got to go do all these things, and then the receiving side of the pilot being like, God, mother.
I don't have exposure to the recruiting team specifically for operations and dispatch. So I was hoping when I was at RTAC to try to speak to someone who could speak to that a little bit, like you're talking about this timeline or what they prioritize, like what they're looking for. And I wasn't able to get any answers there because they essentially only brought their pilot hiring team. So I couldn't tell you, Nick. I hope I can get a job in the desired position because I have a lot of pilot background. And from what I understand is they look at the whole person like anything else. They'll look at your entire makeup. They go, okay, military pilot, civilian, airplane ratings, has education under their belt, or has worked another kind of corporate job before. A lot of different factors that go into that decision, and I don't think there's any one thing you could identify that would say, yeah, this will get this person in sooner than another person who has a different bag of experience.
Have you heard about what the interview process is like? Is it similar to the pilot where they're like, what would you do if this? What would you do if that? Tell me about this. Tell me about that.
Sure. And again, I'm only speaking to United because that's my guy in the school. He has that background and he can speak to that. But like, I can't speak for Delta or Southwest or anyone else. But from what I understand, it's a 3 interview process. So so you apply, right? So you put your application in, send your resume in at unitedcareers.com or whatnot. And if it gets plucked, right, so that it meets all the criteria, it gets plucked, and they invite you to an interview. The first interview they do is kind of like an HR interview, which I think they'll ask some technical questions, and they'll also ask you just, hey, tell me a time when questions. I think a lot of similar stuff to what you've had to do and what the format is for the pilot hiring. So it's a different team that's asking these questions, but it sounds like they're going to ask a lot of similar questions. So that's interview number 1. So if you get past interview number 1, then it's interview number 2, which is actually essentially you're redoing the knowledge exam. Like it's a bank of questions and you have to answer the questions, and it is really similar to just doing the knowledge exam again, which so that's round 2. So you have to be sharp on all of your book knowledge, right? And then round 3 is some sort of board interview or some panel interview, right? So this is where hey, you've made it to round 3. And I think it's maybe a culmination of those knowledge exam questions, but also situational questions as well. And at this point, I think on the panel they have current dispatchers, so it's not just some HR person or someone who can check the box for some written test question. But at this point, it's like, hey, do we want you on our team? Like, I'm going to be your supervisor. Or I fulfill another role. Do I want you working with my team right now? So instead of one big interview, it seems like it's 3 interviews that have been. They made it into this process that's tiered.
Yeah, man, that's a lot of things, dude. I think you bring up a really good point that I guess when you examine what a pilot interview looks like, it's multiple iterations. There's the logbook, and maybe there's a personality test, maybe there's a skills test, maybe there's and then there's the HR portion, and maybe some derivatives of either thing. So, and it's just an 8-hour day instead of like you're going. But man, listen, I could never do this. This seems so hard.
Well, I mean, like anything else, it's a mountain to climb. But once you do the research and you do the networking and you talk to people and then at the same time you also have to make sure your own skills are sharp. I feel like as long as you're doing all those things, then I would think you have a fair shot at whatever comes down the road.
I think you should start a dispatcher podcast talking about like different tips and tricks and stuff like that. I had a great resume thing to put on there and to talk about and to make people, see it. I don't know of any dispatch shows out there right now. Is there? I'm sure you guys, if there were, you guys would be all on it.
I don't think there is, but I guess that's also something to talk about as well, is like the scale of how many dispatchers there are to pilots. So from what I understand is so if the FAA processes thousands and thousands of pilot certificates a year, right, between private, commercial, ATPs, everything, right? So I'm not sure, maybe you know that number, but it's thousands, right? There's a lot of people.
It's a shit ton is the number on the internet. That's what it says.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's a metric load, right? And from what I understand is that there's really only a few hundred aircraft dispatcher certificates that are processed through the FAA per year. So and you think about it too, how many pilots are flying the line around the world versus how many people are sitting in the room at NOC? The proportion is very different, right? So
it's a good point. So
I don't think there is as much of a network for dispatchers, and this is something I saw as well, where the Professional Asian Pilot Association, right? So I joined them, was with them for a little bit. Didn't really end up clicking with them as much, so I didn't really stick around with them. But for them, they have a Discord for like staying connected to people, and they have things broken out by like region geographically, and they also have things broken out by subject. Like, hey, is anyone who needs to talk about military stuff or wants to talk about cargo stuff or 135 or whatever. And at the bottom, they have a little like group or little thing for dispatch. And when I was doing my research, I put it out there. I was like, hey, do we have any dispatchers out here? And I got, I think, 2 responses. One who's like, yep, I got the certificate, but I never ended up using it. And then another one's like, yeah, I got the certificate, and I worked that at, I forgot what company he works for, but he goes, yeah, send me, if you have any questions about the process. So that was one source I got from there. But really, like you're saying, there's not that much community out there, or we're much further flung to the world that we don't really have that centralized community because there's just not that many people. And
that smells like opportunity to me. Really.
Mayhaps.
I mean, like, yeah. I mean, if you want to create that opportunity, that could be pretty fruitful. So I don't know, something to think about.
Yeah.
Get your own Discord.
Maybe. And that's something I think I'm bringing it back to RTAG a little bit. So that was something that was brought up right at the very beginning. So the meeting that happens before the convention, where they bring all the volunteers together and the board of directors, they come out and they, say a couple of words. And it eludes me now which one was talking about, but they're like, yeah, we want to, at RTAG as a passion project, we want to get representation for maintenance, right? We want to have people who can speak to that from airline maintenance, and then have, I would think, from the companies that are there, have someone who can speak to that hiring process to become hired as a certified mechanic. So what I would like, or what I see right now is that RTAG, and I don't know about the other conventions because I haven't been to them, but this particular convention, even though it's rotor to airline group, it's really rotor to airline pilot group. Everything is pretty much pilot centered from the companies I was talking to and running their presentations. The people that brought in for the panels are either pilots or on their pilot hiring team, and they can speak to the process to becoming an FO or a captain at their company. Some of the smaller companies, smaller operators, yeah, they can kind of do a whole, hey, we are looking to hire pretty much everyone across the board. But I think it would be kind of cool, and like you're saying, there's opportunity perhaps for these conventions to expand it to not just pilots, but expand it to other career opportunities that are available at an airline, because you have everything under the sun. It's like this is a huge enterprise. Like you have people who need to do marketing, you have people who need to do the IT, right? All the systems that are proprietary to the company who manage that, and all the maintenance. Gosh, maintenance is a huge other logistical challenge and enterprise that there's so many people involved with, right? To make sure the plane is ready and can provide a service to the customers, right? There's a whole nother world that happens there. And then there's the operation side of dispatch and everything else to have compliance with all the rules and regulations and make sure that people can get from point A to point B safely. There's so many jobs that are out there. And like you're saying, maybe there's a lack of representation, or at least my perception of it going to one of the conferences was that there's a lack of representation for those other professions as it stands right now.
So I think you bring up a very good point. And first off, I don't want to talk outside of school. And I know Joshua and Jim, the president, vice president of RTAG, do listen to every episode because they're awesome and they love hearing everything. So I would say I agree that it is very pilot centric. And I know that my conversations have been about growing opportunity for more veterans to get involved with lots of different parts of aviation. And since you are a veteran and you are in aviation and you are in dispatch, you should pick up the mantle and decide, like, I'm planting my flag as the leader of RTAG dispatch and bringing more of the G, the capital G, instead of making it pilots only. And that would, doing that would be so helpful, because think about being able to offer scholarships for dispatchers to be able to go down that path and to meet and to tell more people about, literally probably in the past 5 years, the biggest way people have gotten the word out about dispatch is listening to a podcast about it, listening to this or listening to one of the other shows that have had a dispatcher. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. And that's literally how a lot of people find out about it. So yeah, go for it. Give Josh a call, send him an email, joshua@rtag.org. That he'll hit you up. I'll also, since we're talking about that, let's shift gears a little bit, because you are a vet and you are in the Guard and you currently drill, and you have to balance, first off, now you're balancing school with your civilian life with your military life. So you're leaning heavy on your civilian life right now. But when you were down in Fort Rucker, you're leaning heavily on your military life and taking a backseat to your civilian life. And so there's this push and pull, this dance that you're having to do. And I haven't talked about that. And when you and I were in the pre-show and talking about what should we talk about, you're like, dude, you have not spoken much about that, why you should join the reserves, what it's good for, what it's not good for. And so I want to explore that a little bit. So will you kind of help us understand it?
Yeah, 100%. This is another thing I'm super passionate about, is trying to explain, because people go, oh, you're in the Coast Guard. I'm like, no, I'm in the National Guard. And they're like, oh, they just don't understand. Like if I'm hanging out with my wife and her friends, they assume I'm some Coast Guard pilot or something. And I'm like, I cannot claim that title. Those Coast Guard guys are another breed, right? Like they're doing some crazy stuff on, some pretty gnarly weather and out there in open seas. I'm like, that's another level. But anyways, yeah, so I'll kind of start from the beginning, because maybe there's folks out there that aren't familiar with like the structure of the military, but you have the branches of the military, right? You have the Air Force, Marines, Navy, Army, Space Force, So
Good
yeah,
job.
there we go. We got them all. And
Coast
Coast Guard, yeah. We got them all within the last minute here. So you have all the different branches, but within the branches, so I'm going to talk about the Army because that's what I'm familiar with. Is that you have the Army, the active duty component, right? Which is kind of what you think about. You go, oh, the 101st, they have a whole bunch of, air assault helicopters and this, that, and the other. So that's the active duty component, right? But you also have the reserve component and you also have the National Guard component. So all three, you wear the same uniforms and you have U.S. Army on your name tape or on your tape on your jacket, and it's like either half or like 60% of the Army's personnel and equipment is actually operated and maintained by a reserve component, right? So this is kind of like a post-Vietnam kind of phenomenon, right? Where we have a lot of these reserve components so the military can flex and meet whatever it needs that it needs to, which is what we saw post 9/11 was that all these National Guard and reserve units were brought up and federalized to go overseas and fill in different roles during a lot of the surges that happened overseas. So talk about the Guard now. So there's the three. So you have the branches of the military, you have your components of each branch, and both the reserves and the National Guard are reserve components. But the difference is that the reserve component is only run by the federal government, right? So we have in the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFRs, right? We often talk about Part 14, right? Because that's the DOT, that's transportation, that has to do with the aviation. But there's a whole bunch of other parts of the CFRs, right, that are out there. And you have Title 10, which is the armed forces. And then you have Title 32, which is just the National Guard. So we kind of fall under a separate rule set when you are receiving your orders and have your control from the state. So the National Guard is weird because you are actually the highest person that you answer to when you're normal drilling, you're at home, is actually the governor of your state. It's not the president. Until you become federalized and you get orders and you get sent overseas, at that point, then you are operating under federal jurisdiction. You get all the federal funding and everything else that comes on your orders. So the National Guard is kind of this interesting component where it kind of does a dual mission of serving the state as well as serving the armed forces and the federal mission as well. So it kind of sits in this in-between area. And I think most people are familiar with you drill a weekend a month and you do 2 weeks in the summer, which kind of, maybe, that's kind of, I think, an old perception of what the Guard is. And that's kind of from a pre-9/11 era.
If you're not flying, that is more the case.
True. So that is what it was when I was in the engineers as a 12 Bravo. It was doing that. There's some additional requirements along the way, but generally, yes. But I would say that the op tempo from when I joined compared to now is that you were expected to go somewhere every few years, right? That was always part of it. So there were additional requirements that were tied to the federal mission.
You're not old enough to remember pre-September 11th where people were just sitting around smoking.
So no, but there are guys of the units that I've been in that's kind of what they reminisce about. They go, wow, the good old days. And I go, oh, okay, well, I don't even know what that looks like.
I'm so old.
Oh no. No. Oh man. I'm not gonna open another can. I'm gonna leave that one on the table right now. But yeah, so the National Guard mission is you're owned and operated by the state, and then within the Guard you have Guard Aviation, and that's where that weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer, that doesn't really apply anymore because you have the same minimums and currency as an active duty aviator. Because you have to, right? If you don't fly, then you're losing your proficiency, and you still have the same currency minimums too. You still have to fly a night vision goggle flight for at least an hour every 60 days, right? You still have to do a live rescue hoist. Well, actually, I think it's 90 days after duty. It's 120 days in the reserve components. I think that's literally the only difference. Otherwise, your flying hour requirements, how much instrument flying you have to do, how much night flying you have to do, is exactly the same as the active duty component.
The number of approaches annually, which all the helicopter guys like, shit, here we go. I gotta knock out some more approaches.
Man, actually, instruments is kind of like one of my favorite things to do. But even in
That's
the
good.
Lima, because like you actually get to fly it. You don't have the flight
You
director
don't
and
have the
everything
glass.
else you got, and maybe
Yeah.
something more fancy. But I love flying. Like, dude, keeping those needles centered in ILS, oh, that's like satisfying.
Do you guys have PARs up there? Is that like, do you do that up there? Do you know it?
We have done them in flight school, so we are familiar with radar approaches, but there just aren't really that many up where we are at to practice on a regular basis. So I think the last time I've
The
done one
best
is
approach.
probably in flight school down in Alabama.
Yeah, listen, if you don't know what a PAR is, y'all, like, it's the best approach. It's so nice having somebody talk you down. It's so nice. Um, yeah, you're right. Like, that's really difficult. I want to sit there for a second, because if you don't live within proximity of where you drill, it is an effort to get there. And if you need to have that effort to get there, um, it's easier. It's easier the less people that are involved in your life, the less people that are impacted by you going somewhere, the easier it is. And I found that to be the case. I was in the Navy Reserve, and the longest I ever commuted, I was living in Pensacola, flying to Norfolk to fly my helicopter, the 53, and it was really difficult because I had to buy my own tickets. You weren't getting paid for stuff, and that's it was basically I basically spent like $1,200 a weekend, and I get paid like $900, and that's how it went for years, and that's tricky. So something to think about.
Yeah, that is definitely a huge balance thing. Is like I said, you have all the same requirements you have to meet, so you have to figure out your own schedule, right? And that's kind of a challenge or a challenge into itself to manage your schedule between your civilian employment, your family life, and then you have to do all this guard stuff. And what I ended up doing is following some recommendations from some of the guys that have been around in the guard for a while. And that's something about the guard as well, is people stick around in the same unit for a long time. You have
Bro,
people,
forever.
man, you got people that have been there for like, well, a couple of them retired this last year, but they've been in the same organization, in the same units for like 30, 35 years, which is
Yeah.
unheard of in another military unit. There's no one who's going to stick
Wow.
around that long.
Yeah. People, you're like, you're in your
I'm
50s,
like, what?
and you've been here since Reagan was in office. Like, what are you doing?
But man,
Wild. True.
those guys are, oh my gosh, like I'll just say this, like they're super valuable to have those people that are around that have all that tribal knowledge. And like you're saying, like they remember how the flying was before we went to coin. So now we're kind of getting back to a lot of other tasks, which actually isn't inventing something new. It's learning what we knew before when we were prepared to fight the Cold War. But
Yeah.
can of worms, we're going to leave that one on for now.
Yeah. That life is tricky. When we got kicked off going to war, and back in 2001, 2002, man, there was this huge, everybody was so nervous about how do we fight again, and how do we war? And there was a lot of things. So anyway, I digress. Sorry.
But what are we talking
Podcast.
about? Work-life balance, trying to figure out the military stuff. Right. So you have all the
Yeah,
same requirements. So whatever you end up doing, you have USARA, you have things that protect you from losing your job, right? So you give them
that's
a memorandum.
let's talk about that real quick, because
Okay.
that's USARA is the law that allows you as a military member, as a reservist, to go work in the military and not get fired from your job because you rolled out on Tuesday.
Exactly. They have to. They cannot fire you or hold punitive action against you for taking time away from your civilian job to go do your military job. So you are protected in that manner. But still, even with that protection, it is a challenge to do career progression, right? So this is something I've talked
Yes.
to someone else about, and something that I was experiencing, which is kind of led me to the choice of I'm going to do something in the aviation industry. So I was working downtown in Chicago as a tax accountant at one of the accounting
Were you a
firms.
CPA?
I was working on that. I was 2 out of 4 tests in, and I decided, you know what? Instead of doing the other 2, I'm going to start doing some pilot ratings.
I'd rather
So,
die. Oh my God.
man, so when I had to do my knowledge exam for the dispatch, I was like, oh, okay, just study all these questions, got it. So I was finding it difficult, right? Because I got back from flight school, and I just started at the accounting firm that I was at. they're not one of the big four, but they're in the top 10 in terms of size of revenue and clients. And so you go there, and kind of their assumption too is that this is going to be your full-time thing. You're going to commit yourself to learning this profession and this business, and which kind of worked out in some regards because I didn't have kids, I wasn't married at the time, and I was like, yeah, sure, I'll buckle down and focusing on that, but also focusing on all the things I need to do in the Guard and learning how to be a good pilot. But those two skill sets don't overlap, and when you have to take time away, so here's kind of maybe a picture. So we have tax season, right? So January through April, it's really busy. So I would do a couple of flights in there to do currency. I would go into the unit like one evening to do a single goggle flight, which could maintain my currency, but I was losing it, right? So I was just out of flight school. I did my progression at the unit. I was feeling pretty good about my abilities to control the aircraft and do all the maneuvers and task to standard. And then I left to do tax season from January through April, where you're doing the 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, and you would take the one day off, and actually it was actually a problem because of course I could keep my job, but in professional services I couldn't deliver certain deadlines, right? They go, hey, the client needs whatever it is, they need a draft of this by Tuesday. I'm like, okay, but I'm gonna go do my drill weekend for Saturday and Sunday. I can get it to you on Thursday. They go, okay, and then they just take that job, whatever that client work is, and they give it to another associate. Because like as a manager, they're like, I need someone who can do it on that deadline, right?
Yeah.
So then when
I want to sit on this too, because this is important if you are considering the Guard or you are considering professional business. If you want to, I think about my buddy Ryan, who is a senior vice president at one of the world's biggest consulting companies. And he and I were junior officers together in the Navy, and I stayed in the reserves. He got out fully, and he just kind of exploded up into the successful realm because he could work all the hours and he could do all the work. And if you're working for pick your Goldman or Booz or Deloitte or whoever, and if you are expecting to have this meteoric rise professionally, you're not going to have it with the reserves. It's going to stifle it. If you're cool where you are, plus or minus about 10%, like you can stay where you are as far as like hard hitting professional business, like spreadsheets, freaking T charts and all the crap. Like, sorry, but that's important to realize. And I want to bring that to people's attention.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider with what you're trying to pair your military career with and your civilian career, right? So if you work, let's say we had a guy, he worked for a small architecture firm or whatnot. They had like a team of like 4 people. So if he had to leave to go AT for like 2 weeks, he had to do training for 2 weeks, or he had to do a course for 3 weeks. That team is down the fourth
25%.
person. They're down 25% manpower when that person's gone, which, like you said, you have protection. Like they can't fire you for going and doing your military service, but at the same time, you're not tied in with what you're doing at work. Like you're saying, you're not going to be the one to get the, hey, I have an important client, I have an important job, I need to give it to someone. You're not going to be that person they pick because honestly, you're just not as reliable as someone else because you have to do the military stuff, right? So
yeah, exactly.
It's just a reality of it.
TRICARE, baby. TRICARE, let's go.
Yeah, let's go. You get Reserve Select. It's awesome. It's $45 a month. It's great.
Yeah, and with a family of 7, it's like 220 or 40 or something like that. So
fantastic.
Yeah, it's good. It's a win-win.
So you got to. So there's benefits, right? But there's also challenges, and I think that's kind of what we're trying to discuss right now. And maybe I have my brain scattered all over the place, but I think what we're trying to discuss is the benefits, but also the challenges of trying to be an aviator in the Guard or in a reserve component while trying to keep your civilian career progressing. And I think, it's the reality of the situation is, you'd like to think that you can do it all, right? That you can crush it at work, you can crush it in the military, and be signed off as a PIC, lickety split because you're doing everything you need to do. But you really have to make certain compromises, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I've had to navigate myself. But then I also see in everyone else coming back from flight school to the Guard is that Yes, you've been on this track for 3 or 4 years, however long it's taken you to get to flight school, and then you go to flight school and you knock it out of the park. You do all the things. You get certified to fly the aircraft. You get your commercial rotorcraft instrument license. All these great things. You go to your unit. They give you some orders, and you do a lot of flying, and they sign you off. Yeah, you're a readiness level progression 1. You're a mission qualified pilot, and then from there, you're just on your own. They go, cool. Are you coming on your additional flight training periods? Schedule it whenever you can find time, but then it becomes a part-time job, and you're down to making 20, 30 grand a year doing that part-time job, so that doesn't really pay the bills. So you kind of have to figure out something else, and that's the biggest challenge, I think, is finding something that fulfills that balance. And that's, you have to have a hard conversation to yourself and your family maybe about what are the priorities and where are we in life right now. So that's a lot of things to deal with, and I think that's something that they don't tell you up front when they go, hey, you want to be a helicopter pilot for the Guard? You go, I mean, yeah, that sounds really cool for helicopters, but what does life look like 5 years down the road once you are one?
That is a good point about the money that you make or don't make, and how are you going to finance your life other than looking for that job. So, which is also why a career in aviation is really interesting for people that are in the reserves, because of this. It's a union job, and they don't like it. It doesn't matter if you're there Monday through Friday. It doesn't matter. All it matters is that you have a seniority number, the end. And so you're never going to get promoted faster if you are in the military or not in the military, if you're in a union job. And so it doesn't matter. If you're trying to make it for yourself and you're trying to hustle doing some other thing, then yeah, there's a big barrier there. But like aviation, whether it's dispatch union, pilot union, flight attendant union, pipe fitters union, whatever. If you're a union person, it's way easier to be in the reserves, because you just go, you come back, you still progress up, because it's a pay scale based on time, not based on performance. And that's just fact of life. So, some goods and bads to being in the Guard or any segment of the reserves. And you just you have to ask all the questions. And the good part is after your initial commitment is over, you have the opportunity to reassess, and you have to decide if that's good for you. Like, your life circumstances are going to change during that period of time. But also, if you're thinking about flying and you're thinking about wanting to get into it as a professional aviator, yes, great opportunity. Air National Guard, regular Army Guard, like all the different, or National Guard, like whatever it is, look at all of them. Look at the perspective opportunities and go for it, man. Like it's a good thing.
As much as we're talking about maybe some of the challenges, like, it is 100%, like, you're not going to get these experiences, anywhere else, right? And you kind of get both worlds, where you get to experience a lot of the military experience per se, right? You get to go through, flight training like every other military aviator, and you get to go do cool missions. And like the Air Guard, yeah, like for their training, they're like, yeah, we flew over to Germany and did some refueling missions for some folks over there, and that was our training weekend. Like, that's so cool, And then you go back to whatever job you're doing elsewhere, and they go, what do you mean you just get to do that part time? You're like, yeah, I mean, I do. And so you kind of get to do both things. And like we're talking about before, like I'm talking about compensation on lifestyle, but then you also get that fulfillment of like, yeah, I'm serving my country. I'm doing the mission. I'm doing the thing. And especially in the Guard too, like, we get in-state emergencies too, where, hey, we get a call out and we are doing something, and they go, hey, we have a missing person. We have a missing, teenager or something like that in this county. We're going to go look for them. Like, we're going to go tie in with the police department. And we actually have a specific radio, a technosonic radio in our helicopter, that we can tie in and talk to all the emergency services in the state. So you get to actually do the mission. I think that's super fulfilling, and that's something that you won't be able to get that elsewhere. So that's something to consider in terms of like, man, yeah, you could be that guy working, in the city, and you're crushing it as a senior managing director and making all the money, but at the end of the day, you got a pile of money, but what else do you have? So
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have the stories about finding the lost little girl or all the things. And also, heads up, if you live in a state that is prone to natural disasters, you are going to be leveraged by your governor quite often. So I think California, I think Louisiana, I think Florida, I think Texas, and probably a bunch of other states that I didn't mention. But something to consider, that you're like something big goes down, like you're on the hook. Man, you live in Virginia, or and like Virginia is a big. They do a lot of different things too. So just things to consider. Dude, we've been talking for over an hour, and I could talk for about another 5, and I love it. I really appreciate the conversation, just the candidness about the dispatch world, and then also being in the Guard and what it's like, and being able to be present to both sides of the coin, the civilian side and the DoD side. And also, I appreciate all your volunteering with RTAG. I do think that you should reach out and start a corner of the community and encourage veterans to find out more about dispatch, because it's a great job and it's a great opportunity. Everybody needs to find the thing that's best for them. And I love that you just kind of went down this rabbit hole like, yep, let's go. Let's do it. So you're awesome, my man.
Cool. Awesome. Nick, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I think we talked about it in like the pre-podcast, but I just never thought I would be on this side of it doing recording versus just sitting on the train platform listening on Spotify. So this is pretty cool.
Wait till you hear how weird it is to hear your own voice on recording. You're gonna be like curling your skin. You're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I hate hearing my own voice. At least that's how I am.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes.
See you, buddy. Have a great day.
Awesome. You as well, Nick.
All right, pilots, that's a wrap on this episode, and I know what you're thinking. You need to make yourself a little bit better. So how do you make yourself a little bit better? You tighten up your resume. So here's what I want you to do. Go over to my website, spitfireelite.com/podcast, and you can download my free resume template. It is tight, organized, and it's the perfect pilot resume. It's just something I like to do for the pilot group, and it is free to you. So go over there, spitfireelite.com/podcast, and download your free resume template. While you're over there, look at all the services that we offer. Lots of great interview prep, lots of great application review. Everything you need to be a professional pilot is right there. spitfireelite.com/podcast. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next episode.